10 minutes, maybe 15, and it took me like a half hour today. Like everywhere I tried to go, there was just huge backups.
Yeah, it's usually just like 64 and 5.
I was there volunteers. She had the whole thing on there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a wrap.
I'm just checking in everybody who's here. Thank you all again for being flexible last week. I appreciate it. So I'm better, but I'm not all the way better. So sometimes I used to sound like I'm going through puberty, and sometimes I do sound like I'm dying. I'll just start coughing. But I mean, I've had this thing for over a week. There's no way I should be contagious, and I'm double masked as per usual to protect you all. So
Is it like they just start using voice?
I don't know. I mean, it must be. It must have gotten it somewhere. It must be. So when I read online about it, because I was debating whether to go into the doctor, and basically it said like, no, it's a virus. I can't do anything. And like the best thing to do is just vocal rest, which is what I did last Wednesday. Like I think I told you all on Friday. That's literally the first time I've ever like canceled class because I was sick. But it was just like I opened my mouth and the other came out. And I was like, well, I can't teach. So Wednesday I just didn't talk all day, and that helped it start to get better. And then I've been trying to rest it in between. But yeah, apparently it's going around because someone in my 9 o'clock class has it now. So again, I shouldn't be contagious anymore because it's been over a week. But
It's just information.
right.
I used to get it all the time, and I was talking to friends. And so when I was in America, I really
Yeah, I've gotten laryngitis before and still taught. But because it's never been that bad. Like I've literally taught with like tea in one hand and vitamin water in the other. And I've now realized that probably wasn't good. I probably shouldn't like model that sort of unhealthy behavior. So I'm trying to be better about things. Yeah. So thank you for letting me work from home because it was a lot easier to hear me than if I'd been here and I was like, and so hopefully I'll stay healthy the rest of the semester and it won't be an issue anymore, but God only knows. So we'll just do that. What's that? Right, that's true. So fingers crossed, knocking wood, all that good stuff. Alrighty, so before we get into everything today, I wanted to do, and actually I'll stop sharing screen so the folks at home could see a little better, not me in a little tiny corner. Just do a little show and tell with some of the things that I was talking about on Friday. And of course, I got here, and it turns out my MMPI 3 materials are not here, which means they're in my house somewhere, which means I could have showed them to you all on Friday, but oh well, I'll bring those in on Wednesday. So the first thing I wanted to show you all is the SCID. So the SCID is the structured clinical interview we talked about the other day. And so it is really helpful as a beginning therapist, learning, how to do things, how to query things, and it's good for research as well. So like there's a screening module where you just kind of go through with some of the major things people might have, and it tells you exactly how to ask. So has there been any time in your life when you've had 5 or more drinks, beer, wine, or liquor on one occasion? Most of us would probably answer yes to that, right? That doesn't mean that the person has a substance use disorder, right? Like a habit. But what it means is that we want to query more. Is this a pattern, right? So if they say no, you move on and you don't have to do that module, which is cool. So it saves you and the client time. If they say yes, then you go and you do it. And maybe you can end that module after like 2 questions. If they're like, yeah, it was one time on my 21st birthday, right? By the way, like Side note, don't ever try to do the like 21 shots on your 21st birthday. Like that's a really good way to die. Unfortunately, like your body just can't keep up. God. No. You did it, Nicole, you did it. Yeah, the other thing that was popular when I was in college was the 24 beers in 24 hours. Don't do that either. Like, give your liver some time to process things. You know, don't die. I like you all. I don't want any of you to die. And then, have you ever used street drugs? Have you ever gotten hooked on a prescription medication or taken more of it than you were supposed to? I like this version that I learned on. This is the 2002 version, and they're already aware that like opioids could be a problem, right? Before like the rest of the country was paying attention. Have you ever had a panic attack when you suddenly felt frightened or suddenly developed a lot of physical symptoms? Were you ever afraid of going out of the house alone? Things like that. And each of those is its own like set of questions you'll go through if they say yes to that, to see if they might have that disorder. Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah, so typically you would have someone who's trained to give this particular one, but for example, a lot of physicians will ask similar questions, like the screener, or like I don't know if you all are running into this. A lot of my doctors now have you like check in online beforehand and ask you these types of questions there. And then like when I worked on the VA, I think it was like every 6 months, questions like this would just pop up on the computer and guide me through asking clients them. So yeah, screener questions like that, a lot of different people are using. The full SCID, typically you're gonna have a mental health professional who's trained to give it, if that makes sense. So yeah, I told you about the mood disorder one. Let me give you another example. So like, this is the obsessive-compulsive disorder module. Now I'd like to ask you if you have ever been bothered by thoughts that didn't make any sense and kept coming back even when you try not to have them. And then if they say that, you say, what were they? Right, because you want to text out, were they obsessions or were they like hallucinations, right, or delusions? And if they're like, yeah, I always feel like my hands weren't clean and I need to wash them over and over, then, you know, and there are examples you can give that they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. You're like, do you ever think of hurting someone even though you really didn't want to, or being contaminated by germs or dirt? And then you have those thoughts and you try hard to get them out of your head. So then you can get to, yeah, they have obsessions. And then the next page is, do they have compulsions? So was there ever anything you had to do over and over again that you couldn't resist doing, like washing your hands again and again, counting up to a certain number, checking something several times to make sure you've done it right? What did you have to do? Why did you have to do it? What did you feel would happen if you didn't do it? That type of thing. And so it's, you read the questions word for word. And again, this looks pretty thick, but the nice thing is with that screener, you end up skipping big chunks of this that don't apply to your particular client, which would usually take 30-ish minutes with each client. And again, not something that typically every psychologist will do. I think it's mostly used in research settings, but like you learn to do a variation of it essentially. So like when I was working in the managed care setting on my internship, I basically made my own shortened version of the SCID for the most common disorders I saw. So like a lot of our referrals for the program I was on were people who had borderline personality disorder. So I had the symptoms of that written out for myself in question form so that I could ask them about it. All right, the MMPI. So very cool. I have the original on how this would have been presented. So they actually used to have, I think, and I don't have a copy of the answer sheet, but there would be like a bubble sheet that you would just put here and you answer the questions, and this gets smaller. So there'd be like each column sort of revealed and which one you answer. That's cool. And this is the original MMPI from the 30s. Actually, this one, yeah, copyright 1943, sorry, from the 40s. And then this one was actually brought out in 1970. And this was the 567, I would guess. Let me double check. 566. And the number one item is I like mechanics magazines. Right, so here, that was the number one item for quite some time. So original MMPI, and then when you got away from that, you could do this version, where it just has all the items, and then you'd have a bubble sheet to go with it as well. So you would reuse this booklet and not have to buy as many, essentially. But same items. I like mechanics magazines. There's some other good ones here. During one period when I was younger, I was engaged in petty thievery. Love the language. My table manners are not quite as good at home as when I'm out in company. And then you get the more extreme ones, like I believe I'm being plotted against. I believe I'm being followed. Things along those lines. Much of the time I feel as though I've done something wrong or evil. I can get at like some of the guilt that comes in with depression. That doesn't make sense. And then I have some materials for the MMPI2RF. And like I said, I will bring in the 3 on Wednesday. I really thought it was here, but it's not. So this is actually, I told you I was in one of the first workshops ever for the 2RF, and this was actually our handouts from that. And so how they walked us through everything, and then they had some samples at the back, which was really cool. So we kind of like worked through some case studies. So as you can see, the example, and I'll sort of fold it up for our online people. The example we looked at had just like 3 validity scales. Now there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 validity scales, different ways of looking at if people are responding correctly or not. And then there are the 3 higher order scales we talked about at the end of the day on Friday, the externalizing thought disorder and internalizing. And then the restructured clinical scale, starting with that demoralization one. So this person was peaking on demoralization and some of the other things as well. And then some of the things we'll talk more about today, but there are other subscales of each of those RC scales. So there's some about somatic or cognitive problems, some about emotional issues, some about behavioral issues, some specifically about interpersonal issues with other people. And then there is a MMPI version of the Big 5 inventory. So it looks at aggressiveness, psychoticism, discontent, negative emotionality or neuroticism, and introversion. And then it will also give you, when you pay for the official report, again, trying to show our people online, it will give you key items that they endorse that you should pay attention to as the clinician. So like this person endorsed things like the future seems hopeless to me. Although I'm not happy with my life, there's nothing I can do about it now. I recognize several faults in myself I won't be able to change. This person also said, I have had periods of time where I carried on activities without knowing later what I had been doing. So some aberrant experiences, right? In particular, they will show, like if they endorse any of the suicidality items, this will be sort of highlighted. And the way we did the MMPI, because it was research-based in my training clinic, is every client got it. And then we as clinicians wouldn't get their report until we'd had 3 sessions with them after the event, so 3 actual therapy sessions. And so then we'd be given a list of descriptors of the client to say whether we thought the person was that or not based on our 3 sessions, and then we get their report. And then in the background, they'd be using our clinician data, which is kind of cool as a like 2nd-year grad school person to be considered a clinician, right, at that point. But I was seeing clients, right? And they'd compare it to their actual scores, which is kind of cool. So, but most people would just give it and get the responses. But what I was gonna say is if any of them endorse those suicidal items, we would get notification right away. Essentially like, hey, your client endorsed these items, you should call them, right, and see how they're doing. Then this is really cool. So with the MMPI 1, or just the MMPI, obviously, and the MMPI 2, it was like you got, if you bought the package or bought things, you got like a technical manual that told you information about reliability and validity, like we've seen with the WACE and whatnot, but you didn't get an interpretive manual. So big names in the field, like Jack Graham, who I took courses with, would publish their own interpretive manuals. So it was like Butcher, Graham, and Green were the big three, and it was funny because I met Green while I was on my residency. He came to talk to us, and I happened to sit near him at lunch afterwards. I said, "Oh, you know, I learned from Jack Graham," and he just like didn't talk to me the rest of the time. I was like, "Whoa, I didn't know it was that." Okay. When they got to the RF, they decided that was silly. Everyone shouldn't be interpreting it different ways. So when you buy the RF kit, you just get an interpretation manual. And in fact, the three, they carried that out into it as well. And the two authors on here are, again, another of my grad school professors, Josie Ventura, and then Alcatel again, who's another huge name in assessment. So this is so cool. I loved this so much when I learned how to do this, because the written books have just like giant paragraphs of text that you have to sort through in interpretation. And so like, there's just like, there is paragraphs, but then there's like a box for every scale that says, okay, if they score, in this case, you know, higher, more or equal to 80, right? And again, remember, we're a T-score, so the mean is 50. So 80 is really up there, right? Then this, his or her experiences indicate considerable emotional distress. That's likely to be perceived as a crisis. If they score between 65 and 79, they're still experiencing significant emotional distress, but it's not a crisis. If it's below 39, they have a better than average level of emotional adjustment. And then for each one, which is I love, again, this is new, there are diagnostic considerations. So here are disorders you should consider. It doesn't mean this is what they have, but here are disorders you should consider. So because this is one of the big overarching ones, it just says internalizing disorders, which are like the depression, the anxiety, eating disorders, and then treatment considerations. So in this case, emotional difficulties may motivate this person for treatment. Makes sense. All right, and so then you get that for each scale when we get down to like the RC demoralization. Again, if they're between 65 and 79, they feel sad and unhappy. They're dissatisfied with their life circumstances. If they're again up over that 80, then they are experiencing significant emotional turmoil, feeling overwhelmed, dissatisfied with their life. Diagnostic considerations, evaluate for depression-related disorders. Treatment considerations, evaluate for risk of self-harm, like suicidal behaviors. Emotional difficulties may motivate them for treatment. And the initial target for intervention should be relief of that distress. Makes sense. And then again, like there's all these subscales that we're about to talk about in a couple minutes. And so like, let's say you score high on the self-doubt subscale. So from 65 to 69, you're reporting self-doubt. Over 70, you are reporting lacking confidence and feeling useless. So treatment considerations here are to look at low self-esteem and then other manifestations of self-doubt as targets for intervention. So the really cool thing too is, again, like being in this workshop with Yosi, he just gave us a worksheet for interpreting them that he had made for himself. And so he just said, like, here's the things you should look at first. You look at the validity scales, right? Make sure that you can use it. And then, okay, you go through the three big scales, right? But then you also want to kind of, what he did is basically group the related scales together, which makes interpretation a lot easier. So a lot of, again, making it just I can't express to you. And it wasn't that hard to interpret it in the first place, but how much easier it was to interpret when you just set the thing as sort of boilerplate as that. Sorry, the camera really didn't want to focus on me. So now I'll go back to our PowerPoint and we can talk more about the three. And so the three kind of built on the advantages that the 2RF had created. And the 2RF really was just based on decades of research that Yossi and Tellegen and several other people were doing about sort of looking at the cleanness of the items, things like this. So apologies, when this converted to Google Slides, we ended up with like bad XCCs for years. I just talked about bad charts in my other class, and so this is an example of that unintentionally. All right, so we talked about the MMPI. That was the first thing, 1943. And the goal of the original MMPI was essentially differential diagnosis. They wanted a way to say, what disorder does this person have? And we talked about that empirical coding. They really looked at the clinical scales. And then something I haven't mentioned because it's like passe now, but they came up with what they called code types. So like if you're high on these two clinical scales, there was like interpretations for that in particular. And then they had the validity scales, which were kind of novel at the time, and some supplementary measures. And again, as we talked about, the norms were not really norms, right? Except for Minnesota, basically. So the two came out in '89. So Butcher, Dahlstrom, Graham, Tellegen, and Hammer. And so again, Graham is the dude that I had, and Tellegen is the same Tellegen who is working on the RF and the 3. And so again, they got new norms, they enhanced content coverage, they left the clinical scales as were, they introduced some new scales for content, they introduced new validity scales. This happens a lot when new forms of things come out, especially when you have something that like since 1943 hasn't been touched, right? Or people are like, really, is this better? And then people figured out, yeah, it is. This was also the time where they came up with the MMPI as well, which we mentioned last week. Then you had the RF that came out. Here we go. Minimize that. And so again, this was 2008. And they wanted to represent the clinically significant substance of the MMPI-2 item pool with, again, things that actually made sense with all the stuff we studied the first half of the semester or the first quarter of the semester, right? Thinking about reliability and validity, thinking about things that made sense, using modern test construction techniques, including factor analysis, so getting away from just that empirical keying, improving efficiency, so cutting that number of items down to the 300s instead of the 500s, really making sure they were cleanly measuring the things they said they were measuring. So doing things like pulling out those demoralization items helps with that. And then they augmented those RC scales with needed additional measures. So then the 3, which came out last year, and so they wanted new norms and to enhance content coverage. So they're like, the 2RF is working pretty well, but let's make it better. So they enhanced the scales, they make them even cleaner. They added some scales that were needed. So for example, until 2020, the MMPI had no measure of disordered eating behavior, but they added that, which is cool. It still was helpful to those of us who saw eating disorder clients because people with eating disorders also experience other psychological distress that they often also have an anxiety or depressive disorder. But yeah.
I know, particularly in the early 90s, eating disorders are really common, but actually kind of surprised me that they didn't have it before that around the time.
Right. Yeah, and I sometimes wonder how much of like what happened between 2008 and 2020 was the result of people saying those types of things to them, like, hey, this has been a thing. We know that these are actually a lot more common than we thought. And like, you know, like Yossi and my grad advisor were friends, right? So I'm sure they had chats about it at times. before she retired. So yeah, I think that it is sort of surprising that they were missing things like this. I also like that there's now Spanish language norms, which is really cool. And the other nice thing is that all the research that has been done on the 2RF since 2008 also applies to the 3. So sometimes if you have too big of a revision, it's sort of like you have to sort of chuck that old stuff because it's not as applicable. But so now we have, you know, a decade plus of research to build on with this novel instrument. All right, so a little bit about development, which you all might not be as interested in as I am, but Yossi and Jack made me an assessment geek because I didn't really know what assessment was. I think I've told you all, I didn't have a class like this in undergrad. I learned very personally about assessment in like abnormal, right? And then we took so many assessment classes and I just like fell in love with the idea of it being like a mystery and like the assessments giving you the clues that put everything together. And part of that is how these things were developed. So they started with preliminary studies. So since its inception, the MMPI has been a true false test. But there are other things that are sort of like the MMPI that we'll talk about. We'll probably get to them Wednesday, that are more of a Likert scale. They go from like not at all true of me to very true of me, for example. So they said, okay, well, should we be looking at that? And what they found is that it didn't improve validity to try that Likert scale. And so they were like, well, it's easier for people to just answer true false, so let's stick with that. That's why, like, even with the original, because when I started grad school, obviously, I started grad school in 2004, so we were still giving just the 2RF wasn't out yet. And even with those 566, 67 items, it would take people maybe 45 minutes to fill it out because it doesn't take that long to answer a true false item, particularly when it's about yourself, right? So for efficiency, they kept it that way. And they also looked at improving item content. So getting rid of some of that weird wording. Again, they've done some of this with the MMPI too, but language has evolved since 1989, right? Simplifying. So one of the things we actually haven't talked about in here, and I think I meant to, is that one of the things you want to avoid when you create items is what's called double-barreled. So like, I feel depressed when things don't go my way and when things don't go other people's way, right? That's actually 2 items, right? And it should be 2 items because it could be one or the other. So looking at things like that, trying to see, are we missing some stuff that makes it overly complicated? I love to go to dances, dancing. I am apt to take likely to feel disappointment so keenly, strongly that I can't put them out of my mind, right? So these are exaggerations, but there were things that were like way too wordy that they could cut down. And then they created some new items. Basically, they tried to look at what was missing. What were they not covering? So they consulted with 12 experts in the field, particularly of the MMPI-2RF. They reviewed other measures that are out there that people are using a lot, especially in clinical settings. And so they came up with 135 trial items. And of those, 95 became candidates for inclusion. So they did a lot of research before they got to the point of this being the 3. So then they used some field data. They tried to see, can we make the RC scales even shorter? And so you can statistically look at, can we keep the same validity with a fewer number of items? Like it'll statistically tell you essentially at what point you have diminishing returns and at what point you've now hosed yourself on validity by getting rid of too many items. Some of the scales were lengthened and expanded. Some of the like subscales, so that's what the SP scales are, were really short before. Like I want to say like 3 to 5 items, right? And so like fleshing those out is probably better. The Sci-5 scales and some of the other scales were revised to address items that might have been deleted for other reasons and incorporate other items that might be needed. They recalibrated the infrequency, the trin and the brin. Those are the ones where it's like, are they just answering true to everything, or are they just randomly like making a picture on their bubble sheet, right? So every time you update a test, you have to recalibrate that. And like I said, there are new Spanish normative and also bilingual samples, which is really cool. So they have people who are just like primarily Spanish speakers and then people who speak both. And they use both of those to calibrate it because those two types of people kind of look at language in a different way. So they have a new set of scales here. So a new validity scale, combined response inconsistency, kind of looks at everything overall here. And actually, just a sec, I think I have some notes about this. Oh, I just got really excited that there was a eating concern scale. My personal notes are often kind of funny. I'm just like, woo, eating concern. But yeah, it's essentially like an overall portrait between the Vrin and the Trin of like how consistent or inconsistent they were. And then there's the eating concern scale. Another thing they were missing was compulsivity. A lot of obsessive-compulsiveness, that's a problem. Impulsivity, so that's a big part of a lot of the like externalizing disorders, substance abuse, antisocial personality disorder, intermittent explosive disorder. So that was something else they were missing. And then self-importance is a component that we see in like narcissism, for example, that was missing.
So what was that? Something explosive?
Oh, intermittent explosive disorder is a disorder where essentially you have episodes of anger that are so unexpected, violent, that it's like a problem for you and for people around you, essentially. Yeah, it's a thing. I mean, we don't see it that often, but it is a thing. Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of really cool, in a couple weeks, I think maybe after Thanksgiving break we get to it, let me check. But we'll actually kind of do a very, after Thanksgiving, or no, right before Thanksgiving, we'll do a very like cursory overview of the DSM, and there are a lot of disorders that like no one ever hears about that are kind of cool to hear about. Yeah, it really is. All right, so they substantially modified some scales. So the one that was just anxiety, they have now changed to experiences related to your anxiety, essentially. So things you experience as a result of your anxiety. They took the stress and worry scale and made it 2 different scales. That makes sense. They took this interpersonal passivity one and they flipped it. So now it's dominance. And I think they probably did this just because interpersonal passivity is sort of blamey, if that makes sense. It makes it sound like you're blaming the person for having psychopathology, right? Well, you're just so passive. They got rid of some of the specific scales for somatic complaints, so gastrointestinal and head pain. Got rid of the multiple specific fears, aesthetic and literary interests, and mechanical and physical interests. These were sort of the old masculinity, femininity scales still hanging around. And I think they just decided like, you don't need to measure that. Like it's not actually relevant. So they added 72 new items, but they dropped 75. So we ended up with 335 items. So again, much shorter than the original and the 2. So there are 220 that are still the same from the OG MMPI, right? So the core of the test is still the same, but 47 of those had been revised either for the 2 back in '89 or were revised for the 3 in 2020. There were 43 items that had been created for the MMPI 2 back in '89. They revised 5 of those for this version. And then they have those 72 new items. So again, updating the test, trying to modernize it, trying to get at the things that they were missing since 1943, right? They try to keep the reading level quite low so that people who, didn't get to finish grade school, middle school, high school can still take it. And it's sort of interesting. We sort of asked Yossi, like, how do you determine this? And he said, well, now what you do is you just put all the items in Word and it tells you like Word will come up with a grading level, a reading level. So. All right, so overall there are 52 scales. Now there are 10 validity scales. There's 3 higher order scales still, the 8 RC scales, and then I couldn't remember for the life of me what SP was, the specific problem scales. And those are in categories. So 4 are the somatic and cognitive, 10 are internalizing, 7 externalizing, and then 5, how do you relate to other people? And then we still have those Psi-5 that map onto the big 5 personality traits. And actually, Martin Selbach, who I believe now works and lives in New Zealand, which is really cool, but he was their postdoc. He had been their student when I was there, and he was particularly interested in the Psi-5 and like helped define a lot of this. All right, so the validity scales, and again, some of this formatting is ugly, and I apologize. It's going through multiple, like upload, download, all that good stuff. So we mentioned that combined response inconsistency scale, the CRIN. So it just combines the information from the VRIN and the TRIN and gives you an overall indication of how inconsistent is this person or how consistent are they. The VRIN is the one where they have similar items like throughout the test, and do they answer them the same way? And then the TRIN is the one of like, did you just answer all true or all false? Right. Yeah, yeah. So it's called the true response inconsistency, but it also will tell you if they answered false. F are infrequent responses. The F scale has adjusted since the original MMPI. And these are responses that are infrequent in the general population. So it'd be rare for someone in the general population to report these. Now, as we got further along with things, we recognized there are things the general population wouldn't endorse, but like people with psychopathology will, right? So there's actually a sort of refinement of the F now as well, called the FP. That's infrequent psychopathology responses. So these are responses that are infrequent in people who even are getting inpatient or outpatient treatment. And so that tells you, like, if they're scoring really high on those, either they really have severe psychopathology or it's like a cry for help. Usually, or if it's a legal setting, you got to make sure they're not faking bad, right? To try to like pretend they're NGRI. And infrequent somatic responses are complaints about medical symptoms that like wouldn't go together even in a medical population, if that makes sense. So like they're basically endorsing everything across the board. Again, it doesn't mean they don't have 5 medical disorders, right? It just means maybe they're trying to cry out for help related to physical things going on with them, or their stress is manifesting in physical ways. Then there's the symptom validity scale, the FPS, and this looks at the somatic and cognitive complaints. And then the RBS, the response bias scale, is especially about memory complaints, which is really important if you're looking at lawsuit or, again, criminal case where memory is being raised as a big issue. Oh, I can't remember what I did the day I killed that person. I mean, I don't remember killing them. I mean, right. So the L, there should be a space there, is the uncommon virtues. So this is that old lie scale that was on the original MMPI. So this gets that trying to make yourself look better than you are. So there's a couple reasons why you do this. The biggest one we always point to is child custody cases. Parents want to make themselves look good so that their kids, they get custody of their kids. But it can also be if like your parents dragged you to therapy and you don't want to be there, right? We might see a high lie scale because they're like, no, I'm fine, basically. Yeah,
So I know now that the whole idea of love, it feels like this, how do they feel?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, so Munchausen's doesn't have the same name, but still exists. So it's now called factitious disorder. So there's factitious disorder of self or factitious disorder of another. And yeah, so with these, you would look at things. So if it is on yourself, right, then you would see some of the like FS maybe or the FBS being high. The kid one or the what used to be called Munchausen's by proxy, right, where you do it to someone else who's like under you. It might not pop because they don't necessarily realize the person is doing this, right? So if you're not familiar with Munchausen's or what's now called factitious disorder, it's intentionally producing symptoms in yourself or someone else. So you might take stuff that will make you vomit, have diarrhea. There was an episode of the show House where there was a nurse who like took something to make her urine blue, just so he would be the person who worked on her case because she was so desperate. When you do it to a kid, this is one of the things that ticks me off. Like it makes me so mad when people do stuff to kids. Even before I had a kid, I felt this way. But like the parents will be putting stuff in their food. If anyone's seen the movie The Sixth Sense, there's a case of this in there. Or you know, doing other things. And like in both cases, if you do it to yourself or someone else, you could end up undergoing surgeries and massive amounts of treatment. And like for the Munchausen's by proxy, factitious disorder of another, the way you tell is that you separate them. If you separate the kid from the parent and all of a sudden they get better, that's probably what's going on, right? And then it's, you know, with the one you do to yourself, it's like, okay, we put you in a hospital setting and you don't have access to any of those things. You magically get better, basically. But yeah, that's something that we always need to be on the lookout for as well. And then K is adjustment validity. And it's kind of like L, but it's more like I'm just fine psychologically, as opposed to like I'm a good person. So you might see K come up as well. And at old versions of the MMPI, there was actually like a K correction you could apply that in case it was distorting the scales, you would look at that. I believe they've sort of adjusted it now, so you don't need to do that anymore. Alrighty, so the higher order scales remain the same from the 2RF. We have the EID, which is the emotional or internalizing dysfunction. So these are problems associated with mood, so depression, bipolar disorder, things along those lines, and affect. So also things like anxiety. THD is thought dysfunction. And these are problems associated with disordered thinking. So people with schizophrenia, but also people who might just be experiencing some psychotic symptoms in different ways, or just some unusual thoughts or experiences. The XD is behavioral or externalizing dysfunction. And these are problems with, such a tactful way to say it, under controlled behavior. Basically, your behavior is noticeable and often disruptive or even harmful to you or other people. So again, we see this in things like substance use disorders, like antisocial personality disorder, but also some of these types of things would be in like ADHD, for example. Not anything that necessarily would be harmful, but certainly things we could notice. The RCs are the same, just again, cleaned up. So we've got the demoralization component, unhappiness and dissatisfaction. It's rare for someone who is experiencing psychopathology not to also spike on this, not surprisingly. Then we've got somatic complaints, so health complaints, low positive emotions, that's that depression scale, basically. Antisocial behavior, rule breaking and irresponsible behavior. So this starts to get at more defined version of the behavioral and externalization scale. Ideas of persecution and aberrant experiences would go on that thought disorder one. So ideas of persecution, beliefs that others pose a threat, aberrant experiences, unusual perceptions of thoughts. And then dysfunctional negative emotions would go in that internalizing one, anxiety, anger, irritability. And then hypomanic activation, overactivation, aggression, impulsivity, and grandiosity. Then we get into these specific problem scales, and again, they tend to kind of cluster together. So malaise is just an overall sense of poor health. They don't expect to improve. They don't expect their health to improve. They kind of feel like this is always going to be this way. Neurological complaints is vague neurological symptoms. Obviously, you would need to find out if they've been diagnosed with a neurological disorder before you're just like, oh, you're faking these, right? You can look for over-reporting, but there might be some sort of somatic symptom or conversion disorder. Now we have eating concerns, hooray, problematic eating behaviors. So it looks at restricting, binging, and purging, and also concerns about shape and weight. So that's hitting on all the major symptoms of eating disorders, which is fantastic. Again, wish that had existed 15 years ago. And then there's cognitive complaints. This is where you get those memory problems and difficulties with concentration. It's not a measure of like how well their memory is doing, like the RBAMs that you gave each other. It's a measure of like their experience of their cognitive abilities. And this will be elevated in people with depression, because in depression, especially if you have severe depression, you can experience what's called pseudo dementia, where you actually start having some of the same memory, word finding problems, that type of thing, as you do in people with dementia, simply because depression is just so overwhelming, it can make it difficult to concentrate, essentially. All right, the internalizing, the moralization related, again, the first one we want to look at is the suicidal or death ideation. This is direct reports of thinking about suicide or recent attempts at death by suicide. One item is related to thoughts of death. So on the 2RF, if they endorse one item, it would be like, you need to look at this. Now it's at 58, which is still your cutoff for interpretation, and it'll be printed in bold, so you notice it right away. Hey, you need to look at this. And obviously, if you got two items, then you're going to be up above 65. There's a hopelessness one. When I used to see people with depression and I'd be doing the skid with them, there's a question you ask about this. And if they endorse this, this is like one of the things that would scare me the most, because this is highly related to thoughts of suicide, thoughts of not wanting to continue. Self-doubt, lack of self-confidence, feelings of uselessness. So it's low self-esteem, added items here. They feel they're a burden to others. And it's linked to psychological dysfunction, but nothing specific. And then inefficiency, where you basically believe you're incapable of addressing challenges. All right, let's stop there. We'll pick up with internalizing on Friday. I'm just gonna like make myself a note, or not Friday, Wednesday, right here. So I remember where we left off. Thank you all for being here. So we will finish through this lecture either Wednesday or Friday. Then you will actually give each other some personality questionnaires, and hopefully either sometime this week or next week, we will get back in the computer lab and do some SPSS review.
Well, it does say on the syllabus that on the 8th you have.
Sure does. What we'll do is we'll just see how we're doing this week, and probably by Wednesday, I'll be able to tell you whether that's a thing or not, if we're gonna push it or get through it.
Okay.
Thanks for pointing that out.